Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Somm TV podcast. I'm your host, Jason Wise. Did you know the United States still uses the word champagne on some labels, even though it's illegal almost everywhere else in the world? On today's episode, we'll find out why. Before we tell the incredible story of the battle between France and California for the soul of champagne, I want to talk about Somm TV for a second. We have some updates on what we have coming to the service. We just got back from filming in Greece, filming our next big feature film coming before the end of 2025, and it's a big one. We've been filming across the Mediterranean Sea, including Venice, Mount Vesuvius, and Pompeii, and deep into the Vatican's secret archives to tell the story of a grape that made wine what it is today. We exposed for the first time in this movie a tasting that the Pope and his personal sommelier did in the early 1500s to determine the best wine on earth. This tasting, which has never been told, set wine and grapes on a path that is felt in every glass we drink today. I cannot wait for you guys to see this movie. This movie's going to come out towards the end of this year on Somm TV first, so if you're a subscriber, you're going to be the first to see it. We're also going to be in France and the UK next month filming an all-new Verticals film about the family that changed European wine forever. You won't believe where we got into film during this project. Make sure you subscribe to SommTV.com. And right now you can get 50% off a monthly subscription by entering SommTV50 at checkout. SommTV50. Make sure it's a monthly though, so this is for monthly subscribers. SommTV50 at checkout. Now let's talk about the war for the name champagne in California and the soul of sparkling wine. California has been making sparkling wine since the late 1880s. It's often labeled as champagne. Champagne is a name that is sort of synonymous with sparkling wine. It's kind of hard to, everybody who talks about sparkling wine probably just calls it champagne. Well, California was no different. And America at that time was pretty new. So in order to talk about anything, you were talking about whatever it was. If they had Kleenex back then, I promise you, they wouldn't call it facial tissue. They'd call it Kleenex. But there's a problem. Champagne is of a place. We all know this. We all know that champagne defends vigorously its name. But the battle that California fought and the way this came about is just such a wild, wholly American thing that we had to take a little bit of time on this podcast and just tell the story of America fighting France to get champagne and then eventually lose it. California's journey into sparkling wine began in the mid to late 19th century with the influx of European immigrants. They brought viticultural knowledge to the West Coast. The West Coast was warm. It had great climate. It was a perfect place from a water standpoint. It rained just enough, but was dry. The soil was poor. And the European immigrants who brought their knowledge to this place found a place that reminded them of home. So you had a lot of German, a lot of French, a lot of Swiss who made wine where they lived and looked at the mountains and the hills of California and the valleys that kind of reminded them of the place they had been. So in California, they have iconic sparkling wines like Corbel, Paul Masson. They began producing sparkling wines using similar methods like Method Champenois, and they labeled them as California champagne. Now, a lot of this you got to know. Champagne was treated more as a generic descriptor for sparkling wine rather than a strict geographic designation. In the United States, we didn't have a place called Champagne, but people didn't think of champagne as a place. They thought of it as a drink. It was already pretty famous in Europe and famous in the United States, especially places like New York on the East Coast. If you got a drink, you would call it champagne. So it just made a lot of sense if you're trying to make a sparkling wine to call it what it was known by. Also, there's a thing about champagne that there's a bit of a prestige with the name. So you're trying to sell something that is exciting. You have to know America is expanding into the West. The whole gold rush is happening. And so you're opening up all of these bars and things. And whiskey was important, beer was important, but champagne was a very recognizable name. And people were drinking it to do what we do today, to celebrate, to have a great dinner, whatever it was. And so champagne, the term followed everybody out West, and it came with immigrants. It wasn't just Americans at the time taking the name. It was the people coming from the regions who were drinking champagne there. It turns out that American sparkling wine that they were calling champagne was quite popular. On top of this, and we're going to have to do a little tangent things here as we go through this story because there's a lot to talk about. What happened was American sparkling wine was loved. It was made, but if you know Method Champenois wine, it's not made overnight. There's a secondary fermentation in the bottle, so it requires a little bit of resting. It takes some time. So what ended up happening was people on the West Coast and even people in the middle of the country and on the East Coast started getting California champagne, and they started drinking it. And what this did is it really ate into French champagne. For the time, you have to place yourself in a place where railroads are getting built across the country, so things are starting to move. And it almost became the same work or even easier than transporting something from Europe. Champagne is a place that now is pretty easy. You can fly into Paris, you travel in a car, it's an hour and a half, 2 hours away from Paris, if even, and you can have champagne. But then you had to put all of these bottles on a boat and it would go down a canal. France is pretty much their highway system at the time was canals. In the United States, our highway system became trains. And so the wine from Champagne would go in canals, would go to the ports, would get put in a boat, would get loaded, would go to New York City or would go to the East Coast. And to get it to a place like San Francisco was a real pain in the ass. You got to know that the Panama Canal was not built. It would have to go all the way around South America. So it makes a lot of sense that we would start drinking wine that was grown in this place for a sense of ease. Well, Champagne itself started noticing this. It started eating into their cost and their profits. Champagne got really pissed off. Now, you have to understand that American champagne was not champagne. It was a very different product. It tasted different. It looked different. The bubbles were different. But for most people who were drinking it, they had never had real champagne. Americans that were on the West Coast were there for various reasons. Many moved from the East Coast for the gold rush, for real estate, for other jobs and shipping. This was a very Wild West time period. And so champagne became a thing that was a status symbol. Now, the French wanted to protect that. They don't want people drinking something that means you're important or it's a celebration without them getting a cut of the profits. It's a pretty natural thing. So as global trade starts to grow in the early 20th century, real champagne becomes an incredibly popular beverage. This is where the champagne name takes its true value. The thing that makes it so worthwhile even today is, if you go into a liquor store and you're going to buy a bottle of sparkling wine, if it says champagne, I promise you're probably going to pay more. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We have to go back to this time period in France. There was this root louse. It's called phylloxera. I know we've talked about this on the podcast, and many of you who are wine specialists who listen to the pod know about this, but really quickly, there was this root louse that came from America and American shipping, and from the mid-1800s until the early 1900s, it decimated France especially, but also most of Europe's vines. It got into the roots and it killed all the vines slowly, and what it ended up doing was laying bare to one of the largest sources of income Europe has, which was their wine. And so France was just coming out of phylloxera, and Champagne especially, they were grafting to American rootstock and starting to get their vines back to life, and they desperately needed money. So the champagne producers who were watching American sparkling wine take all of their money in the United States, and with fear that they could start exporting this stuff to places like maybe even England, South America, any place where they were still a known commodity of champagne, they were very worried. So this led to some very early attempts to protect the name champagne on a global stage. World War I is the single most important event that Europe had ever seen on a large scale. It is known as the war to end all wars. In order to talk about World War I, you have to talk about why it happened. And that is crucial to champagne. So Europe itself is a very, very provincial place, especially France, especially Italy, especially Germany. These towns and their identities, they all have their own cheese. They all have their own drinks. They all have their own wine. They have their own grapes. They have their own noodles. They have their own dishes that have to do with, if you go to one place, they have dumplings and they're made with a very special kind of flour. That is important to Europe. This place where they make and grow things and have for many hundreds of years in this place. To contrast that, the United States is big. It's grand. We have the Wild West. We have California, this giant place. We have the frontier. We have big cities. But if you go to Europe, they don't. They have the small place. They have this ham comes from here. And that's built into the mentality of the thinking. All of these problems that were coming up for, 500 years before World War I, where people are interested in the little places. They're interested in this natural resource comes from this town. In World War I, there were treaties that go back, and we can't spend a lot of time on why World War I happened, but we can say that the places of Alsace and Lorraine, which had a lot of natural resources and were a gateway into France for Germany, and culturally had gone back and forth between these two countries for nearly 800 years, were important to each of them. And Germany seized on this when World War I broke out. So you have to look at Europe as a place that had stacks of papers all over a desk, and they all had different topics, right? And after World War I, the winners wanted to file these papers in the right way that they believed were the way to file how it happened. When any war ends, there needs to be a formalization of the end of the war and what that means. In some cases, it is a simple everybody goes home. In other cases, it is a change of territory. And in extreme cases, it is a very complicated document that includes all of those topics and much more. The Treaty of Versailles was the document that was formed and the agreement that was made at the end of World War I. It can't be overstated the anger and pain that this war created in Europe and really anywhere that Europe had any influence. It was a very, very violent affair. And so people were angry going into it. They were all fighting to have it be very, they wanted to bury Germany, let's just be honest. And Germany itself was put in a very difficult position. So the Treaty of Versailles was this meeting and ultimately a document that outlines what happened at the end of World War I. It did involve some changes of territory. It involved some changes of leadership in said countries. You had to have some monarchies step down, be exiled. Governments had to change into different forms of government. It was very complicated, and this could be the dissertation of 1,000 Ivy League students on what the Treaty of Versailles is. But the important thing to understand is there was this article in the Treaty of Versailles where all of the nations, mostly the ones who had won, got together and decided we are going to figure out how to protect the things in Europe. And one of those was Champagne. Now remember, the French won World War I. And so they were trying desperately to protect this word Champagne amongst many other things. You will find Bordeaux and other things in this article. Article 275 of the Treaty of Versailles. And basically the big thing is, and of course they're negotiating huge amounts of money that's going to be paid from the losing side to the winning side, which I don't know if you're familiar with World War II, had some repercussions, but they basically were saying we want money, but also on top of it, we don't want Germany using the word champagne when labeling its wines and spirits. We want to make sure that champagne is a French thing, because in Europe too, just like America, the word champagne had become superfluous. Anything sparkling, they called it champagne. You would see that and you'd think, I know what that is and I'll buy it. Well, now it was time for Europe to assert its ownership over these provincial products that it made. And France pretty much led the way with champagne, as we know today. So Germany undertakes to respect, this is Article 275, Germany undertakes to respect as regards wines and spirits the stipulations of the treaty concerning the protection of appellations of origin, such as champagne, etc. Now, this is a really, really big deal. Every country had to sign this and say, we agree with the provisions in this, some of which were losers in the war and signed it, I wouldn't say the most willing. Others were winners and they were able to pick kind of what was in there. But everybody signed it. There is an incredibly important point to make here, though. The United States was very involved in the Treaty of Versailles. Woodrow Wilson was our president. He was somebody who was working on something called the League of Nations at the time. And it was fully expected that the United States would sign all provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, just like everybody in Europe had done. But the United States didn't do that exactly. The U.S. Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles in 1920. The year after everything was formalized completely, the United States said, nah. And so what we did is we chose to pursue separate peace agreements with every country instead. And that created chaos. Because what Europe didn't understand, and I think didn't have a choice whether they did or not, was that America was going to emerge from World War I as one of the great industrial powers that the world had ever seen. No one had ever been in a position like the United States because remember, the war was not fought on our soil. It destroyed Europe. And we're not even talking about the fact that World War II is about to come and do it on a much grander scale. And America is going to get put back in that savior position that it had in World War I. So this treaty that ended World War I is signed and goes into effect and is really only held in Europe as law. But you have to understand, when the United States did not sign the Treaty of Versailles, it basically said we're not going to adhere to the laws that Europe is saying about places retaining the name of the things they make. You got to think about Parmesan cheese. You got to think about prosciutto. You got to think about different types of sausages. But of course, we're talking about Chianti. We're talking about Bordeaux. We're talking about Champagne. These names are not protected in the United States because the United States never signed the Treaty of Versailles, let alone any of the provisions in the Treaty of Versailles. So, wouldn't France be incredibly pissed off about this? Wouldn't Europe be up in arms about the fact that the United States, who was making sparkling wine and making things they called Burgundy and making all of these different types of products, wouldn't they freak out about this? Well, you'd think so. But there was this movement happening during the late 1800s into the early 1900s, which was anti-alcohol in all forms. And we have covered this numerous times on the podcast before, but people drank a lot in the US. They drank such large amounts that it gave ways to political parties that were pushing for prohibition. I mean, entire presidential campaigns, local mayors. There are dry counties all over the United States because of this time period. In fact, if you go to many of the great whiskeys and bourbons you drink come from dry counties. You can't even drink Jack Daniels in the county that it's made because of this time period. The local administration made it so you could not drink. That's how strong this was at the time. So prohibition is about to come, and Europe knows this. Canada knows this. Everybody can feel. You can feel that people are stockpiling booze and starting to make their own booze under the counter because they're about to pass prohibition. So France kind of thinks, this is an issue and we wish they had signed these provisions, but they don't care as much as they would have because they know the United States is about to make alcohol illegal, which does happen. So in the 1920s, we sign an unfortunate piece of legislature that makes prohibition legal. It makes alcohol an illegal substance outside of religious use, and even then it's pretty regulated. And so for a moment, this whole thing of Champagne and Burgundy and protecting that name kind of goes away. It becomes not such a big issue until, of course, we come out of Prohibition, which happened with much fanfare. We still celebrate it today. I mean, I know all of us have cheers to glass at the repeal day that happens in the United States every year. But what happened following Prohibition, consumption of wine production soared in the U.S. I mean, everybody started drinking wine openly, and wine maintained something that was only starting to happen prior to Prohibition, where it meant status. And if you're going to talk about any wine that means status, it's Champagne. So what ended up happening was you find American sherry, you find American Burgundy, you find American Champagne exploding again. And we're talking about Carlo Rossi's Hardy Burgundy. We're talking about Corbel with their Champagne. They're making things that are starting to eat into Europe's profits, where Europe's now had, 40, 50 years to reassert their dominance that they had previous to the 1800s, where they are starting to become Champagne is the most important wine in the world. Burgundy is the most important wine in the world. And so now we're not only eating to their profits, frankly, we're making garbage and using their name. I'm going to be honest here. A lot of this is jug wine. It's inexpensive stuff. The names are being used to sell, but they're not at the quality level. The entire exploitation of European regions by U.S. producers is made possible by Article 275 loophole from the Treaty of Versailles from 50 years prior. So we are using this loophole that is allowing us to make and use the name because we never ratified that document. So in 1983, the European Commission and the U.S. opened up trade talks on wine. This has been many, many, many years in the making, where Europe is saying, this is unfair. You are not making the product you're saying you're making. And on top of it, it's killing our economy in this place that we've done for 500 years. So there's a trade group, the Comité Interprofessionnel du Vin du Champagne. This trade group formed to organize and protect winemakers during the German occupation of World War II in Champagne. They're the loudest voice in the negotiations. So they're still working after what they were trying to protect against Germany, they are now trying to protect against America. So it takes 2 decades of negotiations, and the European Union, as it's known, and the US, they finally reach an agreement in 2005. This is like, now everybody listening to the podcast, we've talked about what is, basically ancient history for all of you in America. But now, most of you, if you're drinking, were alive in 2005. This is finally when they reached this agreement. In exchange for easing the trade restrictions on wine, the U.S. government agreed that California Champagne, Chablis, Sherry, and a half a dozen other semi-generic names would no longer appear on domestic wine labels, except, and this is a big one, except in cases where a producer was already using those names, which is absolutely insane. So right now, if you go to a grocery store, you will find California Champagne to this moment, and that's a grandfathered in clause. So if a producer had used one of those names prior to March 10th, 2006, they can continue to use the name on their label indefinitely. If you really think about it, this is over 100 years of a fight that Europe has had with the United States to try and just keep the names of the places where it makes things. I think a lot of the American brands that fight tooth and nail. I know the NFL, the NBA, Coors Light, things where you have a brand name that instantly Xerox, Kleenex, Nike. If you say those names, you think of a place, you think of a thing, you think of a person, you think of Michael Jordan maybe. All of those things are so protected. I dare any one of you to go to YouTube and make a video about Michael Jordan and take images and show the Nike and do that story. You will have it shut down. So if you can put yourself in that place and think that Champagne is more like the NBA or the NFL, that is a group of different things together under the identity of a brand, then you can sort of think of the big champagne houses and the little ones and think, is this right? Wrong? And what is the way that it should have gone? It seems to me to be an interesting playbook the United States has done, where we will say, no, we're just not going to agree with that, and go on and on and on. And so in today's modern world, you can still go and buy a bottle of California Champagne. Now, the question is, when you drink that champagne, and it has the name Korbel on it or something like that, does it taste like an actual champagne? I don't have to answer that question because you know the answer. But it does go to show how important and valuable intellectual property is, and how important it is to fight for it, and maybe if you're the United States, how important it is to ignore and fight against it. And with that being said, everybody, I hope you enjoy a bottle of sparkling wine, whether it's called champagne or not. But if it is called champagne, I'd love to know where it's from. Hit us up. It is a pleasure to tell this story, and I look forward to the next one with all of you. I would like to thank everybody for listening to this podcast episode. I would like to thank all of you for giving us great reviews. We see all of them, and it means a lot. Wherever you listen to the podcast, please give us a great review. It really does mean a lot. We're coming off our James Beard nomination, and that is all because of all of you, frankly. That's the reason we were nominated, is because people listen and they talk about the podcast. I want to thank my podcast producer, John Adams, who put this episode together for me. Really, really appreciate that. I want to remind everybody that if you go to somtv.com, you can watch literally dozens of hours on some of the greatest champagne houses and American regions where they're making sparkling wine, including Oregon, which is emerging as one of the great sparkling wine regions of the entire world, who is creating their own denomination, which is called Method Oregon. They are trying to create their own thing that can't be copied anywhere else. So it's an interesting method of keeping identity. And so on SomTV, you can watch episodes from all over the United States, all over South America, and all over Europe that have to do with sparkling wine. So if you subscribe, you can get 50% off on the monthly using SomTV50. Go to somtv.com and use SomTV50. We really appreciate your support. Be safe and drink something nice.